Richard Bissell stood in the CIA's headquarters on May 1, 1960, watching his entire intelligence operation collapse in real time. The U-2 spy plane, his U-2, the aircraft he'd shepherded from Lockheed's Skunk Works to operational status, had just been shot down 70,000 feet over Sverdlovsk. Pilot Francis Gary Powers was alive, captured, and about to become a propaganda trophy for Nikita Khrushchev. Worse, the Soviets now had physical proof that America had been violating their airspace for 4 years. Bissell had built the U-2 program on a simple premise: fly higher than Soviet missiles could reach. The sleek black aircraft cruised at altitudes where pilots needed pressure suits and could see the Earth's curvature. From that height, cameras photographed nuclear facilities, missile sites, and military installations across the entire Soviet Union. Each mission returned with 4,000 feet of film covering hundreds of square miles. The intelligence was extraordinary. For 4 years, it worked. Then Soviet engineers developed the S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile. On that May morning, 3 missiles detonated near Powers' aircraft at 70,500 feet. The shockwave shattered the fragile airframe. Powers ejected, parachuted into Soviet hands, and the U-2 program, America's only reliable method of seeing inside the closed Soviet empire, ended instantly. President Eisenhower suspended all overflights. Congress demanded answers. The Joint Chiefs of Staff panicked because their estimates of Soviet missile strength depended entirely on U-2 photographs. Without those flights, the Pentagon was guessing blind about how many ICBMs the Soviets were building, where they were stationed, and whether America was falling behind in the arms race. Bissell needed a replacement immediately. Not in 5 years. Not after careful development. He had maybe 18 months before the intelligence gap became catastrophic. The solution couldn't be another aircraft. The Soviets had proven they could shoot down anything that flew through their airspace. It had to operate beyond the reach of Soviet missiles, beyond their airspace entirely. It had to orbit in space. Bissell's team had been working on exactly this problem since 1956, before the U-2 ever flew its first mission. The project was called Corona, and it was failing spectacularly. The concept was theoretically simple. Launch a satellite carrying a camera, photograph Soviet territory from orbit, then somehow get the film back to Earth for developing. The execution was proving nearly impossible. Satellites couldn't transmit television-quality images in 1960. The technology didn't exist. Digital imaging was science fiction. The only way to get high-resolution photographs was actual film, the same Eastman Kodak stock used in U-2 cameras. That meant Corona had to physically return exposed film from orbit, which meant solving a problem that had destroyed 12 consecutive test flights: how to drop a capsule from space, survive reentry temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, deploy a parachute at the right altitude, and recover it before it sank in the ocean. 12 launches, 12 failures. And now, with the U-2 program dead, Bissell had no backup plan. Corona had to work. The alternative was entering the most dangerous phase of the Cold War, completely blind to Soviet capabilities. He gave his engineers 18 months to make it happen. The core problem landed on the desk of Lockheed engineer James Plummer in Palo Alto. Plummer had worked on the U-2's camera systems, so he understood photographic requirements. What he didn't understand, what nobody understood in 1960, was how to build a container that could protect delicate film through the violence of orbital reentry, then deliver it intact to a recovery team somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. The physics were brutal. A capsule re-entering Earth's atmosphere at 18,000 miles per hour would hit air molecules with such force that friction heated its surface to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That was hot enough to melt steel, vaporize aluminum, and certainly hot enough to incinerate film. The capsule needed an ablative heat shield, material designed to char and burn away, carrying heat with it as it disintegrated. General Electric's engineers had developed such shields for nuclear warhead reentry vehicles, so the technology existed. But those warheads didn't carry fragile, temperature-sensitive film that would fog if temperatures inside the capsule exceeded 150 degrees. Plummer's team designed a gold-plated capsule shaped like a badminton shuttlecock, 40 inches long and 27 inches in diameter at its widest point. The blunt heat shield faced forward during reentry, creating a shock wave that deflected most of the heat. Inside, the film canister sat wrapped in layers of insulation, protected from both heat and the 20G deceleration forces as the capsule slammed into thicker atmosphere. Getting the capsule down was only half the problem. Once it descended to 60,000 feet, a barometric switch triggered parachute deployment, a 12-foot drogue chute for stabilization, followed by a 300-square-foot main parachute at 15,000 feet. The capsule would drift down at 24 feet per second, giving recovery crews maybe 20 minutes to locate it before ocean impact. The Air Force proposed helicopter recovery, but ocean swells made surface pickup unreliable. The capsule might fill with water and sink within minutes. They needed to catch it before it hit the water. Enter Captain Howard Swede Carlson, who suggested something audacious: catch the parachute in midair, using a specially modified cargo aircraft. The Air Force had used similar techniques to snag research balloon payloads, but never at this scale, never over open ocean, and never with million-dollar intelligence photographs at stake. The recovery aircraft, a C-119 flying boxcar, would trail a 50-foot steel cable with a trapeze hook. The pilot would fly directly at the descending parachute at 150 miles per hour, threading the cable through the parachute's shroud lines. Once snagged, a winch operator would reel the capsule into the cargo bay. The entire maneuver required hitting a target the size of a car, drifting unpredictably in ocean winds while flying at near stall speed. Test pilots called it insane. Plummer called it the only option that doesn't involve swimming. The first 12 Corona missions would prove both assessments accurate. The satellite itself was built by Lockheed under the cover designation Discoverer, ostensibly a scientific research program. Few people knew that inside each Discoverer satellite, a panoramic camera built by iTech Corporation waited to photograph Soviet territory at 5-foot resolution from 100 miles altitude, if the recovery system ever actually worked. Discoverer 1 launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base on February 28, 1959. The Thor Agena rocket performed flawlessly, placing the satellite into polar orbit. Then the recovery capsule's timer malfunctioned. Instead of ejecting over the Pacific after 17 orbits, it fired early, sending the capsule into the Arctic Ocean, where Soviet trawlers likely recovered it before American ships arrived. Plummer's team lost not only the capsule, but potentially the entire camera system to Soviet intelligence. Discoverer 2 launched April 13th. This time the capsule ejected on schedule, but the parachute failed to deploy. It hit the ocean at terminal velocity and disintegrated on impact. Recovery crews found scattered debris and nothing else. Discoverer 3 never reached orbit. The Agena second stage failed to ignite. The entire assembly tumbled into the Atlantic. By June 1959, Bissell had spent $15 million on 3 complete failures. Congress wanted explanations. The Air Force wanted results. Lockheed engineers wanted to understand why systems that worked perfectly in ground tests failed catastrophically in space. Discoverer 4 through 8 launched between June and November 1959. 1 exploded during stage separation. 2 achieved orbit, but their capsules failed to eject. 1 ejected properly, but the parachute tangled. 1 transmitted telemetry, showing the capsule had survived re-entry and deployed its parachute. Then the Navy lost the signal and never found it. Each failure revealed new problems. The ejection mechanism froze in the vacuum of space. Vibrations during launch damaged the parachute packs. The barometric switches that controlled chute deployment couldn't distinguish altitude changes in the thin atmosphere at the edge of space. Lockheed's engineers redesigned components after each mission, but space kept finding new ways to destroy their carefully engineered systems. Discoverer 9 launched February 4, 1960, 3 months before the U-2 shootdown. The capsule ejected, survived reentry, deployed its parachute, and drifted toward the recovery zone near Hawaii. 4 C-119 aircraft circled, pilots scanning for the distinctive orange parachute against blue ocean. They never saw it. Post-mission analysis suggested the capsule landed 400 miles off target due to winds aloft that meteorologists hadn't predicted. Discoverer 10, 11, 12, and 13 all failed between February and August 1960. The pressure intensified. Each launch cost $5 million. $50 million spent, 0 successful recoveries. The U-2 program was dead. Corona was supposed to be operational by now, providing the photographs that Pentagon analysts desperately needed to assess Soviet missile deployment. Senator Stuart Symington demanded to know why the CIA was spending millions on a satellite program that couldn't catch a basketball dropped from a stepladder. Bissell had no good answer, except that spaceflight was harder than anyone had anticipated. In Lockheed's Sunnyvale facility, Plummer's team worked 16-hour shifts, testing and retesting every component. They built thermal vacuum chambers to simulate space conditions. They dropped test capsules from balloons at 100,000 feet to verify parachute deployment. They modified the recovery aircraft with longer trapeze cables and more powerful winches. 12 failures, $50 million. 18 months of congressional investigations, engineering setbacks, and mounting doubt that aerial film recovery from orbit was even possible. Then Discoverer 14 sat on the launch pad at Vandenberg, scheduled for August 18, 1960. The Thor Agena rocket ignited at 12:58 p.m. Pacific time, punching Discoverer 14 into a polar orbit that would carry it over the Soviet Union 7 times in the next 24 hours. ETEC's camera system activated automatically, photographing a 3,000-mile swath of Soviet territory with each pass: missile facilities at Plesetsk, submarine pens at Polyarny, bomber bases across Siberia. After 17 orbits, the satellite's timer triggered the ejection sequence. Explosive bolts fired. The recovery capsule separated cleanly and began its fiery descent. Captain Harold Mitchell was flying his C-119 in a racetrack pattern 350 miles northwest of Hawaii when the recovery coordinator's voice crackled through his headset. Capsule descending on schedule. Estimated impact zone 2 miles ahead. Mitchell had made 11 previous attempts at aerial recovery. He'd watched parachutes drift away in crosswinds, seen capsules disappear into clouds, experienced the gut punch of missing by mere seconds. Every pilot in the recovery squadron knew the statistics: 12 launches, 0 catches. At 60,000 feet, the capsule's drogue chute deployed. At 15,000 feet, the main parachute blossomed, 300 square feet of orange nylon, visible as a bright dot against scattered cumulus clouds. Mitchell pushed the throttles forward, adjusting his approach vector. The capsule was descending at 24 feet per second. He had one shot. The C-119's loadmaster, Technical Sergeant Lewis Walters, positioned himself at the open cargo door, watching the 50-foot trapeze cable trail behind the aircraft. The hook at the cable's end had to pass through the narrow gap between the parachute's shroud lines and the capsule itself. A window, maybe 3 feet wide, on a target oscillating in ocean winds. Mitchell aimed for an intercept on point 8,500 feet above the Pacific. Too high and the parachute might collapse from the turbulence of the C-119's prop wash. Too low, and they'd run out of altitude if the first pass missed. He flew at 150 miles per hour, the aircraft shuddering near stall speed, every control input deliberate and smooth. The capsule grew larger in his windscreen. Walters called out distances. 50 yards, 30, 20. Mitchell held his course, fighting the instinct to adjust at the last second. The trapeze cable swept toward the parachute shrouds. "Contact!" Walters shouted. The cable snagged. The parachute jerked violently as 400 pounds of satellite capsule suddenly transferred its weight to the C-119. Mitchell felt the aircraft yaw left from the asymmetric load. He corrected, adding power to compensate for the drag. Walters activated the winch. The cable reeled in slowly, pulling the capsule through the cargo door. The entire catch took 47 seconds. Inside, the gold-plated capsule was 3,000 feet of Eastman Kodak film, exposed through ITEC's panoramic camera during passes over Soviet territory. The film had survived temperatures of 3,000 degrees during reentry, deceleration forces of 20 Gs, and parachute deployment at supersonic speeds. It had captured more Soviet territory in a single day than all U-2 flights combined had photographed in 4 years. Mitchell flew directly to Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. The capsule was immediately flown to Eastman Kodak's facility in Rochester, New York for developing. CIA analysts would have the processed images within 48 hours. After 12 failures and $60 million, Corona finally worked. Arthur Lundahl ran the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center in a nondescript building in Washington. On August 20, 1960, he received the developed film from Discoverer 14, 20 pounds of processed negatives covering 1.65 million square miles of Soviet territory. His team of photo interpreters had analyzed every U-2 photograph ever taken. They knew what to look for: the distinctive blast deflectors of ICBM silos, the geometric patterns of radar installations, the telltale shadows of missile transporters. What they found in the Corona images stunned them. The U-2 had flown predetermined routes over known Soviet facilities, providing extraordinary detail but limited coverage. Corona's polar orbit meant it photographed everything below its flight path, including vast stretches of Siberian territory that U-2s had never reached. Lundahl's interpreters examined the film under stereoscopic magnifiers, measuring shadows to calculate heights, identifying vehicle types from their dimensions, tracking construction progress at suspected missile sites. The resolution was worse than U-2 photography. Objects needed to be at least 5 feet across to appear clearly. But coverage was comprehensive. Every airfield from Murmansk to Vladivostok. Every submarine pen along the northern coast. Every suspected ICBM complex that intelligence analysts had worried about since 1957, when the Soviets launched Sputnik. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had estimated the Soviets possessed between 600 and 800 operational ICBMs by 1960. This estimate drove every defense budget request, every strategic plan, every argument for building more American missiles faster. Air Force General Curtis LeMay warned Congress that Soviet missile production was outpacing American efforts by 3-1. The missile gap dominated the 1960 presidential campaign. Senator John Kennedy made it a central campaign issue, arguing that President Eisenhower had allowed America to fall dangerously behind Soviet strategic forces. Lundahl's interpreters counted actual Soviet ICBM installations visible in the Corona photographs. They found the operational R-7 Semyorka missiles at Plesetsk, the primary Soviet launch facility. They identified construction at several other suspected sites. They measured the precise dimensions of support buildings, compared them to known ICBM infrastructure requirements, and cross-referenced everything against signals intelligence and human source reports. The total count of deployed Soviet ICBMs came to fewer than 25 operational missiles. Not 600, not 800, 25, maybe fewer. The R-7 was a massive liquid-fueled rocket that required permanent launch facilities. It couldn't be hidden or moved. Corona's cameras could see every installation large enough to support such missiles. There were no hidden armies of ICBMs in the Siberian wilderness. The missile gap existed, but it favored America by an overwhelming margin. The political implications were explosive. The Air Force had requested billions to close a gap that didn't exist. Kennedy was campaigning on a vulnerability that was fiction. The entire strategic calculus of the Cold War was built on Soviet capabilities that existed primarily in American imagination. Eisenhower, who had authorized the Corona program, knew the truth, but couldn't reveal it without exposing America's satellite reconnaissance capabilities. He sat through campaign debates while Kennedy attacked him for allowing a missile gap, unable to defend himself with the classified evidence that proved otherwise. The photographs from a single Corona mission, captured by a camera operating for just 24 hours, had rewritten the strategic balance of the Cold War, but the technology that made it possible remained highly classified. Duncan MacDonald's office at iTech Corporation in Lexington, Massachusetts, contained a single photograph that reminded him why optical precision mattered. The image showed a Soviet airfield photographed from 70,000 feet by a U-2 camera. Individual aircraft were visible, their shadows crisp enough to identify model types. That camera had a focal length of 36 inches and weighed 450 pounds. MacDonald needed to build something that performed better from 100 miles up, while weighing less than 60 pounds and fitting inside a satellite capsule 29 inches in diameter. The fundamental problem was resolution versus coverage. A narrow-angle telephoto lens could resolve small objects, but photographed tiny areas, useless for scanning millions of square miles of Soviet territory. A wide-angle lens covered vast areas, but lacked the detail to identify military installations. MacDonald needed both simultaneously. His solution was a panoramic camera using a rotating lens system. Instead of pointing straight down like conventional aerial cameras, the Corona lens swept from horizon to horizon while the satellite traveled overhead, exposing a continuous strip of film. Each orbit produced a photograph 10 miles wide and hundreds of miles long, with resolution fine enough to distinguish objects 5 to 8 feet across. The optics required were extraordinary. MacDonald's team at iTech ground telescope quality lenses with surface accuracies measured in wavelengths of light. Deviations of more than 1/1,000,000th of an inch would blur the final image. The primary lens assembly used a Tessar design with a 24-inch focal length and an f/5 aperture, optimized for the spectral sensitivity of Eastman Kodak's high-resolution film. But perfect optics on the ground became problematic optics in space. The vacuum of orbit had no air to conduct heat away from the camera body. Direct sunlight heated the satellite's sun-facing side to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, while the shadow side dropped to minus 100 degrees. Metal expands when heated and contracts when cooled. Coefficients of thermal expansion that don't matter in everyday engineering become catastrophic when optical precision is measured in microns. MacDonald calculated that a temperature variation of just 50 degrees would cause the aluminum lens housing to expand by 0.3 millimeters, enough to throw the entire optical system out of focus. He couldn't prevent thermal expansion, so he designed around it. The lens mounting used titanium spacers with carefully matched expansion coefficients, ensuring that even as the camera heated and cooled, the critical distances between optical elements remained constant. The film platen, the surface holding the film flat during exposure, was made of beryllium for its exceptional thermal stability. The rotating mechanism presented another challenge. The camera scanned perpendicular to the satellite's direction of travel, completing one full sweep every 10 seconds. The motor driving this rotation had to maintain absolutely constant speed. Any variation would distort the image geometry, making measurements unreliable. MacDonald's engineers built a servo-controlled drive system using a crystal oscillator for timing reference, achieving rotational stability within 0.1%. Film capacity was the final constraint. Each Corona mission needed to photograph multiple passes over Soviet territory, requiring thousands of feet of film. The engineers designed a supply spool and take-up reel system that could handle 3,000 feet of film, advancing it precisely between exposures while maintaining perfect tension. Too loose, and the film would wrinkle. Too tight, and it would tear. MacDonald's first camera system, designated KH-1, flew on Discoverer 14 and the next dozen successful missions. By March 1962, iTech had already delivered the KH-2 with improved optics. Resolution increased to 3 feet from 100 miles altitude. 6 months later, KH-3 added dual panoramic cameras, photographing both sides of the satellite's ground track simultaneously, doubling coverage per mission. The KH-4 introduced stereo imaging, 2 cameras offset by 15 degrees, allowing analysts to measure the height of buildings and missile silos from the parallax between overlapping photographs. Each iteration required new engineering. The KH-4A, operational by 1963, carried 16,000 feet of film on 2 separate recovery vehicles. When one capsule filled, it ejected, while the second continued photographing. This extended mission duration from 7 days to 15 days, requiring more powerful batteries, additional nitrogen gas for the camera's thermal control system, and redundant stabilization gyroscopes to maintain the satellite's precise orientation. The Air Force pilots of the 6593rd Test Squadron became specialists in mid-air recovery. Captain Gene Jones caught his first capsule in October 1961. By 1965, he'd snagged 27 more. The C-190s gave way to HC-130 Hercules aircraft with longer range and more sophisticated navigation systems. Recovery crews practiced constantly. Pilots flew training missions trailing the trapeze cable through parachute targets towed by other aircraft, refining the approach angles and closure speeds that maximized success probability. Still, failures happened. The capsule from Mission 56 deployed its parachute, but the shroud lines tangled, spinning it into an uncontrolled tumble. The recovery aircraft couldn't match the erratic descent pattern. It hit the ocean and sank. Mission 73's capsule separated perfectly, survived re-entry, then its parachute failed completely. No drogue, no main chute, just a gold-plated cylinder plummeting into the Pacific at terminal velocity. By 1967, Corona launches occurred every 2 weeks during peak operational periods. Vandenberg Air Force Base's launch complex processed Thor Agena rockets with industrial efficiency, stack the booster, integrate the Agena upper stage, mate the satellite, fuel, and launch. The entire sequence took 72 hours. Lockheed's factory in Sunnyvale built satellites faster than the Air Force could launch them. The KH-4B, introduced in 1967, represented McDonnell's final major improvement. Resolution reached 2 feet, good enough to read vehicle license plates from orbit. The camera used a new Petzval-type lens design with improved edge-to-edge sharpness and a faster f/3.5 aperture that allowed photography through thinner cloud cover. The film itself improved. Eastman Kodak developed higher resolution emulsions with extended spectral sensitivity, capturing detail in near-infrared wavelengths that penetrated haze. Mission tempo increased. In 1968 alone, Corona flew 26 missions. Each launch cost $20 million, $15 million for the Thor Agena rocket, $3 million for the satellite and cameras, $2 million for recovery operations. The HC-130 crews maintained an 85% catch rate, but that meant 3 or 4 capsules per year still vanished into the ocean, taking irreplaceable intelligence photographs with them. The final Corona mission, number 145, launched May 25, 1972. By then, the program had photographed virtually every square mile of Soviet, Chinese, and Eastern European territory multiple times, creating a comprehensive baseline of military facilities worldwide. Henry Kissinger faced a fundamental problem in 1969 when he began preliminary discussions with Soviet officials about limiting strategic weapons. The Soviet Union insisted they would never allow American inspectors onto their territory to verify compliance with any arms control treaty. The United States couldn't sign an agreement based solely on Soviet promises. Without verification, any treaty was worthless. Either side could secretly build additional missiles, and the other wouldn't know until it was too late. Corona solved this impasse without either side acknowledging it publicly. American negotiators knew the precise location of every Soviet ICBM silo because satellites had photographed them repeatedly since 1960. They knew how many missile submarines the Soviets operated because Corona had documented every shipyard and submarine pen, from Severomorsk to Petropavlovsk. They knew the exact number of strategic bombers because the satellites photographed every airfield capable of supporting them. The Soviets knew that America possessed this capability. Their radar tracked every Corona satellite as it passed overhead. They recovered some of the early failed capsules. They weren't blind to American reconnaissance, just unable to stop it. Satellites orbited in space, beyond Soviet airspace, beyond international law that prohibited overflights. Neither side discussed satellite reconnaissance directly, but both understood it was happening constantly. This mutual awareness created a new strategic reality. Neither superpower could hide its nuclear arsenal. In November 1969, the strategic arms limitation talks began in Helsinki. American negotiators proposed limits on ICBM launchers, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers. Soviet negotiators countered with different numbers and definitions. Both sides argued from positions informed by satellite photography that neither officially acknowledged existed. The breakthrough came when both parties agreed to count deployed systems, missiles that satellite photography could verify. Underground silos showed up clearly in orbital images. Submarine pens were visible. Bomber bases couldn't be hidden. The treaty wouldn't rely on trust or inspections. It would rely on what both sides could see from space. SALT I, signed in May 1972, limited each side to 1,054 ICBM launchers for the United States and 1,618 for the Soviets, numbers that reflected existing deployed systems that satellites had already counted. The treaty worked because violation was impossible without detection. If either side built a new ICBM silo, satellites would photograph the construction. If they deployed additional submarine-launched missiles, the submarines and their support facilities would appear in surveillance images. The intelligence prevented war through a different mechanism as well, eliminating worst-case assumptions. In 1960, American planners assumed the Soviets might have 800 ICBMs when they had 25. By 1972, satellite photography provided certainty. Pentagon analysts knew exactly what Soviet strategic forces looked like, which meant they could plan defenses against actual threats rather than paranoid estimates. The Soviets gained the same certainty about American forces, reducing their incentive for preemptive strikes based on exaggerated fears of American capabilities. Deterrence theory required mutual understanding. Both sides needed to know that the other possessed enough nuclear weapons to survive a first strike and retaliate devastatingly, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Corona made that understanding factual rather than theoretical. Neither side could eliminate the other's arsenal in a surprise attack because both sides knew where all the missiles were, how many existed, and could monitor changes continuously. The Corona program ended officially on May 25, 1972, replaced by more advanced systems with digital imaging and real-time transmission capabilities. The KH-9 hexagon satellite could transmit images electronically, eliminating the need for film recovery. Later systems like KH-11 Kennen used charge-coupled devices, early digital cameras, that sent photographs to ground stations within minutes of capture. Film capsules dropping from orbit became obsolete technology, but Corona remained classified. The satellites themselves, the recovery operations, the entire program stayed buried in secrecy even as the technology became historical curiosity. The CIA kept 800,000 Corona images locked in secure facilities, inaccessible to historians, archaeologists, or anyone outside the intelligence community. The secrecy served a purpose. Revealing Corona's capabilities would tell adversaries exactly what American satellites could see, helping them develop countermeasures. If the Soviets knew that 2-foot resolution was achievable from 100 miles altitude, they'd build better camouflage, construct underground facilities, and develop anti-satellite weapons optimized against known camera systems. So Corona stayed classified through the 1970s and 1980s, even as commercial satellite companies like Landsat began offering their own orbital photography to the public. By the early 1990s, the secrecy seemed pointless. The satellite technology was 30 years old. Modern commercial satellites offered better resolution than Corona ever achieved. Keeping the images classified served no intelligence purpose, but prevented valuable historical and scientific research. Vice President Al Gore personally advocated for declassification, arguing that the photographs contained irreplaceable documentation of environmental changes, urban development, and archaeological sites as they existed before modern construction altered them. On February 22, 1995, President Bill Clinton signed an executive order declassifying Corona, along with two successor programs, Argonne and Lanyard. When researchers finally accessed the imagery archive, they discovered the photographs documented more than just Soviet missile installations. Corona had photographed the entire planet during its 145 missions, including regions experiencing rapid development, deforestation, and urbanization. Archaeologists examining images of the Middle East found previously unknown ancient cities. Desert sites that looked barren in modern satellite photos showed clear road networks and settlement patterns in Corona images from 1965 before agricultural development obscured them. The photographs captured Soviet environmental disasters that the USSR had successfully hidden. Images of the Aral Sea showed it already shrinking dramatically by 1968 due to irrigation projects. Environmental collapse that wouldn't become public knowledge until the 1980s. Photos of Lake Karachay revealed contamination plumes from nuclear waste dumping. Decades before Soviet officials acknowledged the site existed. Urban planners studied Corona images to understand how cities grew. Environmental scientists used them to establish baseline data for ecological changes. Military historians compared Corona photographs with declassified Soviet documents, finally understanding what both sides actually knew during the Cold War versus what they feared. The satellites that Richard Bissell commissioned in desperation after the U-2 shootdown ended up creating an archive that transcended their original intelligence purpose. They documented a planet in the midst of unprecedented change, urban expansion, environmental transformation, military buildup, all captured on film that survived reentry at 3,000 degrees and descent through the atmosphere, caught by pilots threading cables through parachute shrouds at 150 miles per hour.